Now, there are fears that President Putin could be preparing to launch a new military assault on the Syrian city of Aleppo, possibly as early as this week. Reports suggest that the Russian leader plans to exploit the political hiatus in Washington, of course, during the presidential election, as he attempts to help his ally, the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, to secure the rebel-held east of the city of Aleppo. Last week, Mr. Putin's spokesman said that Russia had rejected a request for the resumption of airstrikes in Syria. Well, I'm pleased to say that with me is the Russian journalist Mikhail Zygar, who spent years interviewing dozens of sources inside the Kremlin for his new book, which is called, intriguingly, All the Kremlin's Men. Gives a rare insight into the world of Russian politics and what drives Putin as he prepares to run for president again in 2018. Mikhail, thanks for coming in. It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
I mentioned Aleppo in Syria. Before we start talking about the Putin who's portrayed in the book, what is his thinking in terms of the steadfast support that he's given President Assad and the way that he's now possibly looking again at Aleppo? How would you describe his thinking?
You might be surprised, but Aleppo is not the topic in Russian news. Most Russian media, if not ignore that topic, but at least it's not discussed. It's not covered by most of Russian media, and unlike let's say British or American media. And I would suggest that if you ask some Russian insider, some of those people I've been interviewing for 7 years, they would say that that's only the phenomenon of American electoral campaign, and that Aleppo factor is being used by Hillary Clinton's campaign to blame Vladimir Putin for being like mastermind of Syrian crisis.
Accepting that, on the wider point of his strategic decision to support Assad and the Syrian government, how is that being? How do you explain that?
There are two main factors. First, when asked about Bashar al-Assad, Putin or his inner circle, they compare, let's say, Bashar al-Assad to King of Saudi Arabia, and they say, look, both of them are dictators. Both of them are very brutal, but only Syrian president is criticized because he's pro-Russian. And King of Saudi Arabia is not criticized because he's supported by the West. And that's the example of American hypocrisy. That's how people in Kremlin explain the whole thing. But actually, it all started last year after the UN speech of Vladimir Putin, last October, exactly. Because before that, actually, Russia didn't have real interests in the Middle East. For many years, Russia did not participate in any operations, did not have any economic ties with Syria or any other country. And that was very important for Putin to enter Syrian crisis, because he wanted to stop talking about Ukraine, and he wanted to start discussing the global issues. Putin wants to be, as we usually call it, member of the board of directors of the world. He wants to be respected. He wants to be treated as a stakeholder. So Syria gave him a chance to feel like he really influences European Union, United States, and he's back, actually.
One of the many fascinating elements in this book is that you really take apart the image that the West has of Putin, which is of a strong man who's fully in control of all the levers of the Russian state, and you portray him as someone who's actually kind of boxed in, really, by very powerful figures around him. What, for you, is the secret of this man's success? If he's not the strong man that we think he is, why is he so successful within Russia?
He's probably the strong man, but the book is not about Putin himself, but about collective Putin, as I call it. That's the army of Russian bureaucrats, which have one thing in common. They would like to guess what their boss wants to do, and they are acting like the machine, and they are eager to do what Putin supposedly wants them to do, and that's actually the power of the whole system, because Putin is not that strong as the machine is. As I described it, 3 years ago, Putin was very sick and he was absent for 3 months.
Yeah.
He didn't appear in Kremlin. He was actually out of touch even with his press secretary. And that went unnoticed by the audience. No one suspected that Putin is not there, because all the press releases, all the announcements, all the decrees were signed.
Everything happened.
Yes. The machine works even without him.
Final point, Mikhail, if I may, because you used to head up an independent television news station in Russia, and I'm just thinking, in writing this book, which has lots of special access, is not always positive or complimentary about Vladimir Putin. How much of a risk was it for you to write this?
You never think about risk when you're working as a journalist. It's impossible to keep on working and being scared simultaneously. And as I usually say, being an independent journalist in Russia is a hard job, but that's not that dangerous as we really as we sometimes hear in the West. The worst thing that usually can happen to you is that you can lose your job if you're not covering things in Chechen Republic. That might be much more difficult. But generally, you can lose your job. You can lose the license or the office. But generally, online media are quite well. Investigative journalism exists, so I'm not the only one, actually, in the country. No.
Mikhail, it's very good to talk to you, and interesting too. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And thanks for bringing in the book. Thank you very much. Mikhail Zygar there with his book, All the Kremlin's Men.